The fallen leaves tell a story, and so does Elden Ring. It is something that goes far beyond the yellow-bellied slug we find at the end of the game. It is a story of hardship, struggle, and a lot of death, and we find it told throughout our journey in the game. At first, things seem bleak, with round-the-clock "you died" screens and the shattered state of the lands between. The surface of the world is teeming with disaster, aimless foes, and emaciated faces. And if we head deep below the capital, we find a most severe cynicism in the world-ending schemes of the Frenzied Flame and the psychosis of its followers.
Chaos!
But in reality, this pretense of darkness barely shrouds the true, beautiful nature of this epic game and our journey throughout it. As we see in characters like Melina and Ranni, and in the game's overarching design, it is a nature that is joyous in its affirmation of life and embracement of struggle. In this video, I want to look at the story and philosophy that Elden Ring presents, along with some of the influences that inspired its conception of struggle and tragic beauty. I want to dive into the real message of our grace-guided journey, and the radical appreciation of life that it unflinchingly delivers, even after death number 89 to a royal revenant or an ulcerated tree spirit. The first step to understand Elden Ring's joyous outlook on suffering is to look at one of the game's most prominent influences, the dark fantasy manga Berserk. Berserk is a long-running manga that deals with immense struggle and hardship, and it has long been an influential work for From Software and director Hidetaka Miyazaki, especially in this aspect of seeing beauty despite pain. In an interview with Rolling Stone, Miyazaki said that if you were to look at his bookshelf, first you'd spot the manga shelf, with Devilman and Berserk lining the top. Elements of reference to the series can be found in many of FromSoft's games, but there is an especially large number in Elden Ring. To illustrate just a few, we have the following. First, Blythe, a blatant reference and direct homage to the main character of Berserk, Guts. These two share a nearly identical sword, a canine theme in their flesh-melding armor, and an iconic crouching pose, not to mention their shared companionship with short mages. The sword wielded by Blythe, the Royal Greatsword, is basically a derivative of the normal Greatsword, a mainstay in FromSoft games and another reference to Guts and his sword, the Dragon Slayer. The item description of the Greatsword houses quite a number of allusions to the manga's description of the Dragon Slayer and of Guts. Things like a coarse heap of iron, a defeater of inhuman foes, fun stuff. And because two sword references aren't enough, there is a third one in the sword monuments that pop up all over the lands between. These bear an uncanny resemblance to the Hill of Swords, a scene in Berserk, with their only chief difference being the addition in Elden Ring of the massive sword in the middle. With the massive sword, these do look like a real-life monument that's in Norway, the Sverd i Fjell, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but the large sword also looks like the Dragon Slayer. Considering that Berserk's creator, Kentaro Miura, passed away the year before Elden Ring came out, the design of the sword monuments makes sense to be seen as a kind of tribute to the mangaka who influenced the game series so much. Further influences include the crystal tears, which look identical to a tear crystallization from Berserk, and there are also design similarities between the Erd Tree and Berserk's World Spiral Tree. Now, the idea of such a world tree does go far beyond Berserk to many world cultures, from Norse cosmology to other Indo-European religions. But the similarities in presentation do seem to indicate a connection, especially when there are already so many other ties between the two works. For another design reference, we can see similarities between Malenia's winged helm and the helmet of Berserk's Lady Farnese. The similarity is a relatively minor note, but the character who wears the helmet in Berserk, Farnese, is quite the trove of reference. Through quite a few connections, we can see that she is deeply intertwined with our own Roderika of the Lands Between. They are both noble ladies who end up needing to go down paths very different than originally intended. They both learn magic and develop a connection to spirits. And even more on the nose, Roderika was actually listed as Lost Royal Farnese in Elden Ring's 1.00 credits. And lastly, the masculine version of Roderika's name is Roderick, which just so happens to be the name of Farnese's fiancé in Berserk. This list isn't exhaustive, but it should give a good idea as to the degree which FromSoft and Elden Ring are influenced by Berserk. The connection between the works is clear as a Falconian day, so it should make sense why I want to look at Berserk in explaining the mindset and philosophy of Elden Ring. This connection, much like the works themselves, is deeper than just visual designs and character names. It runs down to the very foundations and worldviews of these two works. Berserk is a story about humanity. In following its protagonist Guts, it explores unimaginable levels of pain, suffering, and depravity. Guts is repeatedly driven to desperation and required to push past his breaking point. physically as well as mentally and emotionally. The series is essentially a charting of Guts' never-ending struggle against the horrors and monsters of the world, in addition to the overbearing weight of fate, destiny, and determinism. It's a lot. Fittingly, as Guts struggles against these tribulations, he receives the title of the Struggler from the Skull Knight, his BFF and local portent of doom. The tragic nature of Berserk and the struggling of its hero Guts may seem unceasingly dark and pessimistic. Any reader of the series will agree that its onslaught of blood, guts, death, suffering, and turmoil often feels dreadfully heavy and never-ending, which is also something, to some degree, that fans of Dark Souls and Elden Ring experience, a relentless aesthetic of darkness and difficulty. But to conclude that this is all there is to either of these works is to miss the forest for the trees. The tragedy of Berserk is not designed to get us to give up on life, to view it as some kind of insurmountable darkness. Rather, its goal is the inverse, to instill in us the beauty of life and of the struggle to overcome despite that existing darkness. There is a really wonderful examination of this message and of Berserk as a tragedy in fellow YouTuber and philosopher Jonas Cheka's video, Berserk as a Nietzschean Tragedy. In the video, Jonas explores how the suffering and tragedy of Berserk maps well onto the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, and specifically his view of tragic art as something life-fulfilling and truly joyful. It is important to highlight just how direct of an influence Nietzsche is on Berserk. In one chapter, Skull Knight delivers a warning to Guts, as he is about to start his journey of fighting inhuman monsters and demons. Skull Knight says, "Mind this, yours is a black path through the night. When you confront those who lurk in darkness, you also envelop yourself in it." Which is about as explicit of a reference as one can get to Nietzsche's infamous aphorism, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee." And even more, the warning not to become a monster is another central theme of Guts' story. So, with the explicit references shown, now we can delve into how Berserk fulfills many of the aspects of traditional tragedies. The manga first opens somewhere in the middle of the story, so we see the state of Guts only after some tragic events have occurred. The other earlier chapters of the manga are set before this fall, but because of this opening, we know that this happier period cannot last. This setup pairs with the prophecies of calamity and death that occur in-universe to our characters. They are told their fate, and there is nothing they can do to stop it, despite whatever they may try. This mirrors traditional Greek tragedy like in Oedipus Rex, and Shakespearean tragedy like in Macbeth, where prophecies of doom are foretold. The elements of prophecy and fate are central to Berserk, which it refers to as causality or the laws of causality. That which all things must abide by, the natural flow of things that no individual has any hope to resist. Guts is always found working, in a way, against this causality, steadfastly trying to live life according to his own terms. But Berserk does not present a naive view of free will, which would be something like saying Guts can overcome causality and fate by sheer will or through simply trying hard enough to choose freely. That'd be a little bit too shonen. But at the same time, it doesn't resign itself to a pessimistic fatalism that discounts any personal action or choice. In the tragic tradition, Guts makes his own choices, but those choices do not unilaterally free him from the determined flow of things. As the order of the story shows the viewer or reader, Guts had no way out of becoming the tragic character we find him as in the manga's opening, without a hand, an eye, or a stable, safe life. As Jonas says,
"We know from the very beginning that whatever happens in between, a tragedy will occur, transforming Guts from this into this. And the curse that eventually marks Guts as a sacrificial victim serves as a symbol of the cruelty of fate, just as much as a symbol of his struggle against that fate."
Yet within this tragedy and this determined path of torturous fate, life is not rejected. The suffering and struggling of Guts, like that of other tragic heroes, is not a confirmation that the terrors of life are enough to nullify its value. Instead, it is a vital aspect of the ability to embrace life in its totality, and to say yes despite the darker side. As Nietzsche writes, saying yes to life even in its most strange and intractable problems, the will to life, celebrating its own inexhaustibility by sacrificing its highest types, that is what I found as the bridge to the psychology of the tragic poet, not in order to be released from terror and pity, but instead, beyond terror and pity, in order to be oneself the eternal joy of becoming. That joy that also includes in itself the joy of destruction. The near eternal state of Guts' struggle mirrors that which Nietzsche finds most essential to the human endeavor, becoming, a never-ending process of the will to life. Nietzsche saw humans as constantly changing, without a universal foundation to ground our differing perspectives, truths, and moralities. Because of this, he sees humanity as an essentially transitory process, where the act of growing and becoming something greater and higher is a vital aspect of a healthy life. And this secret, life itself, spoke to me. Behold, it said, I am that which must always overcome itself. Guts is one of the ideal examples of Nietzsche's conception of becoming and self-overcoming. He is always in a state of struggling, needing to grow to overcome his previous self, that he may survive and hold on to life. His journey even begins with a resolute piece of advice from Skull Knight. Struggle, contend, endure. That alone is the sword of the one who confronts death. To once again quote Jonas because he does a great job in explaining Guts.
And his character is precisely a call to never give in to resignation, but instead to struggle beyond all limits, even when it seems overwhelmingly futile, even when the gods are our opponents, even if we're told that the very laws of causality are working against us. Guts, undeniably, is a tragic hero of the Nietzschean variety.
The struggle of Guts is a representation of what it takes to live. While the afflictions of real life may not be as immediately grotesque as the monsters of Berserk, they require the same spirit of struggle and self-overcoming to be met. And at the same time, they and the overcoming they demand illustrate the beauty of that life. To Nietzsche, Berserk, like every true tragedy, shows us that, at the bottom of everything, life is indestructibly powerful and joyful. In the whirling chasm of its suffering and anguish, we see at the same time the entirety of life and the beauty of that human struggle. The struggle becomes art and a consoling force to the one who finds themselves perplexed by the suffering of existence. In this state, the experiencer of the tragedy, whether that tragedy be a story or our real lives, finds that art saves them, and through art, life saves them. And to conclude the section with a final word from Jonas, which is only fair because of the great debt this analysis owes to him.
And Nietzsche's hope is that we can value life as a work of art as well, to see life as something that does not need a happy ending to justify it, because its beauty eternally justifies itself. That is what tragedy teaches us. What Kentaro Miura created was, in my view, a tragic celebration of life. And in celebrating his life, we celebrate also life as a whole.
With knowledge in hand of the tragic beauty of Berserk and a taste of the philosophy of Nietzsche, we can return to our central focus, Elden Ring, to see how it breathes this same tragic beauty to life, both in its story and in its gift of struggle to the player. Like its predecessors, Elden Ring defends the beauty of struggle and of life. Game director Hidetaka Miyazaki confirmed that From Software's infamously tough approach is a vital part of their design, saying in a New Yorker interview, "In our game specifically, hardship is what gives meaning to the experience. So it's not something we're willing to abandon at the moment. It's our identity. This identity is not one of oppressive hardship for the sake of itself or some otherwise masochistic tendency, despite what it might seem, but rather out of a desire to have as many players as possible to experience the joy that comes from overcoming hardship." In Miyazaki's words, we can see a theme of similarity to the struggle of Guts and the tragic beauty we already discussed. Hardship offers an avenue to experience joy through its overcoming, and Miyazaki ventures that this aspect of tragic appreciation is something that can be especially tailored to the medium of games, saying, "Death and rebirth, trying and overcoming. We want that cycle to be enjoyable. In life, death is a horrible thing. In play, it can be something else." Like the previous games on FromSoft's mantle, Elden Ring makes the play version of death a focal point of its experience, and it does this by presenting two viewings of struggling and death, one in the narrative and one in the gameplay. While the player obviously meets with the difficult gameplay Miyazaki intended, the player character is set up to face hardship too. Elden Ring's narrative of struggling is found in our player character's role as a Tarnished in the Lands Between, and with many of the characters we meet on our journey. We struggle against monsters, demigods, and gods, in like manner to Guts and his cadre of similarly supernatural foes. We face unending defeat and death, but coming back to life at sites of grace and stakes of America, we continue to fight, undeterred by the hardship. We abide by Skull Knight's advice to struggle and endure, facers of death that we are. A narrative focus on perseverance is commonplace for FromSoft. While it was showcased most aptly in Dark Souls with the narrative mechanic of Halloween, feel free to check out my video on the subject, it still maintains in strong fashion in Elden Ring, and in the underdog status of our Tarnished, once spurned by grace. This also plays into the justification of the tragic, like we saw in Nietzsche and Berserk. By us playing as tarnished, the game defends and justifies struggle by setting up our journey to be dependent on it. Our character cannot succeed at the game's stated goals, whether that be overcoming demigods, reaching the Erdtree, or mending the Elden Ring, without struggling and self-overcoming. The self-overcoming even happens literally too, through the in-game leveling mechanic, and we have thereby found out that level 1 runs are confirmed, not canon. Each level we add is our character tangibly becoming stronger than they were before. The game also features numerous other characters and story elements which serve a similar narrative role of signaling to the player that the struggle is worth it. I'll leave the details of each until a later section, but just to highlight a few of the major examples, there is Melina, our constant companion who emphatically rejects the frenzied flame and its denial of life. Whereas it would delve the world into chaos to cease the suffering of individuated life, Melina would protect and further life and the beauty within it. This corresponds to the views of Nietzsche in seeing art and beauty as a saving grace, a metaphysical comfort from the reality of suffering. There is also Ranni, who features the longest and most substantial quest in the game, opening up whole new areas of exploration along with an iconic boss fight. In her quest and ending, we see that she seeks self-determination and the chance to have individual choice in life, despite its cost of solitude and darkness. This corresponds to Nietzsche's emphasis on absolute freedom of self, and as the price of this freedom, how one must be accustomed to living on mountaintops. And for a final example, there are the various NPCs like Goldmask, Fia, and the Dung Eater who craft their own endings, trying in spite of the machinations of gods and a corrupted world to make change in that world, struggling to make it a better place. Well, better is in air quotes for the Dung Eater. Elden Ring never stops embracing its narrative struggle, and in doing so it offers the beauty of the world of the lands between, and our experience playing through it. A quote from Nietzsche that Jonas uses to refer to Berserk applies just as well here to Elden Ring, that its stunning visuals and grandiose world reveal a fantastic excess of life. This excess contrasts with any shrinking away from life or embracement of pessimism, or the flame of frenzy. Through the darkness, the light and beauty shine. And as Maria from Eurothug 4000 puts it beautifully in her video on Elden Ring,
"It's that flowers bloom even on battlefields."
And Maria also says of Elden Ring that,
"To me, this is FromSoft's game that's most full of life in comparison to the Souls games."
which was just too close to Nietzsche's phrase, excess of life, for me to not include it right here. While our own tarnished character doesn't necessarily have a tragic prophecy, they do have to face a dark world, tragic figures, and unending struggle, just like Guts and other tragic heroes. And depending on our choice of ending, we can have a tragic conclusion too. But as we saw with Miyazaki's comments, the experience of this world is also tragic for us, the player. Our player character doesn't struggle alone. After all, from a gameplay perspective, Elden Ring is hard. As is characteristic for From Software, Elden Ring is a difficult game. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of cheeky creators, article writers, and Reddit commenters that are jumping up and down to say that Elden Ring isn't hard, it's actually just, and I don't care. I don't. You die a lot during a playthrough, you encounter lots of failure. Ergo, the game is hard. It is difficult. Saying anything else is pedantry, especially when Miyazaki himself says that hardship is our identity. With this difficulty, we as players find ourselves struggling. We must go through the same acceptance of struggle and self-overcoming as Guts, though we do have somewhat lower stakes, playing a video game rather than fighting demons which are hunting us to the death. Now, in-game, we face the repeated death that the game demands of us, dying to its virtual monsters and demigods in our struggle to reach the game's end. Those of us who do reach that end only do so by becoming better at the game, learning the enemy's attacks, to some degree at least, and overcoming the older versions of ourselves who were unable to vanquish the Tree Sentinel at the start of the game. This struggle of gameplay is one more aspect of Elden Ring, delivering to the player the message of worthwhile tragedy, like we have seen in Nietzsche and Berserk. And this aspect is also highlighted well by a contemporary professor and philosopher of games, C Thi Nguyen, who I only now realize is the only living thinker that I am sourcing ideas from in this video. In his book, Games, Agency as Art, Nguyen looks at our reasons for playing games, especially difficult ones, where he discusses gameplay engaged in for the sake of the aesthetic quality of the struggle. To Nguyen, one of the main reasons we take up games is that we get a positive aesthetic experience from our gameplay. From the delicately crafted struggle found in Elden Ring, players are doing something difficult for the experience of harmony between their utmost capacities and the practical world. Our abilities match up with the challenges of the game, and this harmony gives us a pleasurable experience. The challenge engages us. In real life, there is often no such harmony. Our abilities fall short of the tasks, or the tasks are horribly dull. But in games, unlike in life, the experience can be designed in such a way as to bring the challenge in line with our capacity as a person, or to try to reclaim that modern-day slur as a gamer. This affords us a pristine opportunity for overcoming, and a way to get familiar with the process of overcoming in a kind of controlled environment which has been sculpted by the game designer. It is the same as in the case of literature like Berserk, where all the challenges and struggles were sculpted by the story's author to be the perfect fit for the story's hero. The story of Guts is of a character struggling through precisely what Kentaro Miura had designed for him, that he may overcome and that we as an audience may appreciate this overcoming and the life that allows it. However, unlike literature or any other medium, the occurrence of this process in games and video games brings with it a unique experience. The reader of Berserk or the watcher of a movie must, to some degree, passively absorb the work they are experiencing. There isn't anything to do but follow along with the words or pictures. In contrast, a game is only possible with the activity of the player. Elden Ring can't play itself. The player has to give some input or else they'll stand at the first step all day, getting called maidenless by Vare.
You are maidenless.
In this active gameplay comes a unique opportunity for artistic appreciation. Elden Ring presents not only tragic beauty and affirmation of life, but it presents these as something for us to experience as players. The gameplay that Nguyen discussed, that we engage in for the sake of struggle, is part of his definition of something called aesthetics-driving play. This is a specific kind of game playing that occurs when a player takes up a game or challenge, not necessarily for the purpose of winning, but more importantly for the experience of the play, for experiential qualities of the struggle, according to Nguyen. Nguyen introduces this definition through a discussion about him and his spouse playing a board game, High Frontier. He talks about how their skills are evenly matched and that this makes for wonderfully thrilling and mesmerizing matches. Nguyen says that despite the thrilling, high-effort gameplay, he is obviously not playing with a final purpose of winning. Yes, of course while he is playing, he is trying to win, but he does not pursue this end at the exclusion of all else. After all, as he notes, he could read strategy guides or get training from a more experienced player. This would jump him ahead in skill and lead to him winning more often, but he doesn't do this. Nguyen holds back at the cost of a higher chance of victory, because winning isn't his most valuable goal. Playing is. Specifically, playing with a high degree of struggle and difficulty. That's where the fun is. The aesthetics-driving play that Nguyen describes here is possible only if we can, as he argues, take on two different agencies. An agency here being an ability to act as an agent, to make choices, to decide things, and to reflect on and consider those decisions. Nguyen says this gameplay, where you're not actually trying to win, but you're trying to win in the moment, involves two layers of agency. One outer layer agency is where we value the play and appreciate the aesthetic experience of struggle that occurs while we play. It's sort of a more passive observer, and it's what decides not to read strategy guides in Nguyen's case. Another inner layer agency is where we are trying to actually win while playing the game. It's the active layer that is involved in the real-time playing and trying to win. This dual agency, according to Nguyen, allows us to aesthetically appreciate our own experience of gameplay. The outer layer can reflect and marvel at what the inner layer is doing. This is what allows many Elden Ring veterans who desperately want to beat the game to handicap themselves with self-imposed rules, like no summons, no magic, only melee strength builds, basically the FromSoft equivalent to 1v1 Me Fox Final Destination no items. They are doing what Nguyen did with High Frontier. While playing with summons would let them win faster, it would also take away what they really want, the mesmerizing moments with the combat and bosses of the game. They, well, it's sometimes we, want to intimately learn the kits of the bosses, even if it takes dozens of deaths. We want the struggle of the gameplay. Whereas Malenia with Mimic Tier can be a cakewalk, Malenia solo can be a clinic in suffering. And this suffering is part of what makes the experience a fun one and an artistic one. Video games, like Elden Ring, can offer tragic struggle as art that can not only be appreciated but actively taken part in. To appreciate the suffering and overcoming required for life, Nietzsche thought we had to see it aesthetically, as art. We should really look upon ourselves as beautiful pictures and artistic projections of the true creator. And in that significance as works of art, we have our highest value, for only as an aesthetic phenomena are existence and the world eternally justified. In games, we can actively take on this role as artistic projections, as we meld with the game itself through gameplay. In our appreciation of our own struggle as art, we find justification first for the struggle of the game, then for the struggle of life, and finally for life as a whole. When it comes to appreciation of tragic beauty in FromSoft games, I've tried to show that it isn't just gameplay or story. Elden Ring, like the Souls franchise before it, delivers a struggle in narrative as well as gameplay. But even that recognition leaves something out. It is not just that these two aspects of the game hit the same theme. It's something that goes even further beyond this. In mirroring and emphasizing each other, the gameplay and the narrative combine to create the ludonarrative, a term occasionally abused in the world of game analysis, but one that is indispensable if we want to talk about games that utilize their gameplay to help tell their story. The ludonarrative is something I talked about in my Dark Souls and Halloween videos, and it is even more relevant to that game, but it's still an important part of the story of Elden Ring. More than the sum of their parts, gameplay and narrative coinciding can create a more intense, full-fledged experience of a particular game's message. For Elden Ring, this message is the importance and value of struggling, persevering through hardship to overcome. It's not just that the gameplay is hard and the story shows people or our character enduring. It's that the gameplay reaffirms the narrative message by incorporating that message into itself. The gameplay delivers the message the story presents. And because it is gameplay, this means that we as players actively experience the message we receive. We play a part in creating the ludonarrative idea and message of the game. This also reemphasizes Nguyen's framework of aesthetic-striving play. Again, we get a two-pronged fork. First, we get to appreciate the aesthetic experience of our gameplay, the struggle which is found up to and in the harmony of our skills and the game's challenges. We get to marvel at that FromSoft balance of combat and our part in it. But now, we gain a second aspect of appreciation. We appreciate the aesthetic experience of the game's creation of ludonarrative, how our gameplay reifies the game's narrative message of struggle. We help create the ludonarrative experience, and at the same time, we appreciate that experience and that creation. This double level of creation also delivers strongly on our Nietzschean analysis. We saw before that by understanding life as art, can the world and its struggling be justified. But we cannot forget that art is something which must be created. So only through the creation of that life art does the justification of life take place. In Nietzsche's words, creation. That is the great redemption from suffering, and life's growing light. In this treasure of creation is where Nietzsche finds that the entire world of torment is necessary, so that through it the individual is pushed to create the redemptive vision, and then, absorbed in contemplation of that vision, sits quietly in his rowboat, tossing around in the middle of the ocean. One of the most powerful ways that games, like no other medium, can provide this art is by utilizing the ludonarrative, the blend of game and story. In doing so, games, like Elden Ring, can call us as players into the creation of art, and at the same time, they go further. They let us appreciate that art, they let us take part in the contemplation on the rowboat. Now before we reach the finale of the video, I wanted to expand a bit on the really strong Nietzschean vibes of some of the characters and story elements in Elden Ring. This isn't technically necessary to deliver the main point of the video, so you can skip to the final section if you're pressed for time. But I think it does a good job of fleshing out the Nietzschean themes, like the value of struggle and of life, and how prevalent they are throughout the game. The first and most prominent of these examples can be found in Melina and her opposition to the Frenzied Flame. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the deepest cynicism and rejection of life that can be found in Elden Ring is in the Frenzied Flame and its acolytes, the Three Fingers, Shabriri, and Hayata. I covered this in my previous video on the Frenzied Flame, but it's worth repeating here as it's really relevant to the discussion. The Frenzied Flame wishes to end life in the lands between. It wants to melt everything away with the yellow chaos flame. Hayata explains it all.
All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again.
The philosophy of the Frenzied Flame is that of pessimism, a view that life's pleasures are not worth its suffering. So it would rather end life as we know it, melting away our individual experiences to meld us all together as one, where we will no longer suffer the pain of having an individual realized consciousness. But Elden Ring does not present this as simply another option among many. When we are one step away from committing to the path of the Chaos Flame, we may receive the wisdom of grace. Melina, our constant companion throughout the game, offers a rebuttal.
If you intend to claim the frenzied flame, I ask that you cease. It is not to be meddled with. It is chaos, devouring life and thought unending. However ruined this world has become, however mired in torment and despair, life endures. Births continue. There is beauty in that. Is there not? If you would become Lord, do not deny this notion. Please, leave the frenzied flame alone.
Melina offers this pleading from a thematically privileged position. She is someone who, like Torrent, has been on our side from the very beginning. The game never gives us any reason to doubt her or view her as a malicious actor. In this way, the game itself advocates against the path of the frenzied flame, by having its rebuttal be delivered by one of the game's only seemingly chill and decent people. And this message is furthered by its syncing up with the other themes and influences of the game, like the valuing of life despite its associated struggle. We can see a similar back and forth to the frenzied flame and Melina in the works of philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and, yep, you guessed it, Friedrich Nietzsche. Schopenhauer was actually Nietzsche's main philosophical mentor, and he was also a full-fledged pessimist and denier of life. He had much to say on how life is a disappointment, and we can get a flavor of his thoughts in the following passage. If you try to imagine, as nearly as you can, what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if, on the Earth as little as on the Moon, the sun were able to call forth the phenomena of life, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. It is from this influence why we are able to read from Nietzsche quotes that sound like they could have come directly from the frenzied flame. Things like, "We must therefore regard the state of individuation, of life, as the source and primal cause of all suffering, as something objectionable in itself," not too far from the language of mistake used by Hayeta. But recall that in this analogy, Nietzsche stands as Melina's counterpart, not a chaos sympathizer. And he is able to do so because he broke with Schopenhauer in how he thought we should respond to the character of life. Nietzsche agreed on the prevalence of suffering, and respected Schopenhauer for his ability to call out this truth. But instead of clinging to morality and decrying life as evil, Nietzsche chose to let morality go so that he could accept life, embrace its beauty, and say yes to it. And it is in tragedy that Nietzsche says we find a metaphysical comfort which shows us that, in spite of the perpetual change of phenomena, life at bottom is indestructibly powerful and joyful. The perpetual change of phenomena can be read as the fractures that the Three Fingers speak of, and the comfort of tragedy, of art, lines up nicely with Melina's pleading to value the beauty in the world. Melina is the mouthpiece of Nietzsche and an advocate of life. She offers a rare occasion where the game directly communicates its message, to say yes to the struggle, to say yes to life. And while they aren't quite as explicit, other characters in the game echo this advice. We see it in strong display with Ranni and her ending of Stars. The game nudges us toward this ending by having it come at the culmination of Ranni's quest, a quest which is the most involved in the game, opening up new sections of the map and bringing us one of the game's most iconic boss encounters. Now, this doesn't prove that this is the canon ending. FromSoft rarely gives such a declaration, but I do think all of this content being associated with one quest shows that FromSoft views Ranni's quest and ending as one of the most important. And the themes of this ending are another example of the valuing of life and self-overcoming. I've already explored the interpretations of this ending in previous videos, both in the voiced English and in the original Japanese, as there are some translation issues with the English. Despite the issues, I came to a similar conclusion in both analyses, that the seeming dark portent of the ending was not as sinister as it seemed, that Ranni's ending was actually one of hope and self-determination. It is a recognition that life comes with problems, in Ranni's case the order and the influence of gods, but that we can still value life all the same. And we should strive to overcome these issues, though it may take us on a path of fear, doubt, and loneliness, into darkness. Despite a dark exterior, this ending is resolutely one of hope and of striving for the better. In this way, it mirrors Nietzsche and his philosophy, which is often maligned as that of an edgy atheist, but does truly have dark overtones in its acceptance of the gravity of suffering. This is akin to Ranni's ending, which is seemingly dark, but in reality its core is one of hope and a positive view of life. The self-determination of Ranni also mirrors the self-determination that Nietzsche prescribed for humanity in the wake of the death of God, as he saw it. Whereas Ranni can only push away the influence of the outer gods, Nietzsche saw our society as having to grapple with the end of the concept of God, the upsurging lack of faith in society eroding him entirely and exposing him as a concept created by humanity. Nietzsche saw this moment as a freeing one. Just as Ranni, and we as her tarnished consort, must chart a path in the cold night sky, Nietzsche saw this moment like the charting of a course on a now open sea of morality and human valuing. Finally, the horizon seems clear again, even if not bright. Finally, our ships may set out again, set out to face any danger. Every daring of the lover of knowledge is allowed again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Maybe there has never been such an open sea. To Nietzsche, this freeing moment was a new dawn, and while Ranni's ending may be one of the night, it cannot always be night. The dawn and the day come. It is up to us only whether we are ready for them. And through Ranni's journey, I see the message of Elden Ring as one which implores us to be ready, to live joyously in the along. I'll also take just a moment to comment on the other ending variants of the game, the ones we get from Fia, Goldmask, and the Dung Eater. In each of these, we see lowly Tarnished doing their best to right the corrupted world they find themselves in. Okay, maybe Dung Eater doesn't really want to right the world per se, but you can't say he's not struggling. This ability to stand up to the brokenness of the world and decide that life is worth trying to struggle for something better speaks to these characters and their ability to say yes to life. In them, we see another example of the kind of Nietzschean acceptance of life and struggle that I have been tracing in the game throughout the video. And lastly, before I conclude this section, I want to make a special note of a more minor character in the lanes between. I want to talk about the warrior jar Iron Fist Alexander. Alexander could surely be the subject of his own video, as was Ranni and to some degree Melina, but I cannot avoid speaking about him here for he fits too well with so many Nietzschean ideals. Alexander is a yes-sayer like no other. Despite his form being a poor and fragile fit for the world, he deigns himself a warrior and inspires others to the same ideal. To Nietzsche, a man, or a man-jar in this case, must be trained for war. All else is folly. As a warrior, Alexander surely fits this prescription. But more importantly, he is one who strives to always grow and overcome his past failings. He absorbs warriors after the Radon festival.
I'll grow even stronger.
He tempers himself in the fires of Mount Gelmir.
Oh, mountain of fire! Bake me in your flames!
He seeks out challenge in combat and revels in its glory. And in the culmination of Alexander's story, we find a true moment of tragedy and beautiful exuberance of life. At our last meeting, we find each other in Farum Azula, and Alexander, marveling at our slaying of the fire giant, makes a request of us. A request to do battle.
I've been longing to fight a warrior as accomplished as you.
To see a friend as a rival and to respect their strength is how Nietzsche thought that we should view friendship. He says, in one's friend, one should have one's best enemy. In honoring this final request of Alexander, we present him with his best enemy. And in warrior respect and shared understanding, he may be ours as well. The fight commences, and it is hard fought. At its end, Alexander, in a brilliant acceptance of life, says this.
All vessels are destined to one day break. But the great Alexander lived as a warrior to his last.
Iron Fist Alexander lived. Despite his circumstances and the crumbling world around him, he lived as one of the shining examples of positivity and exuberant vitality in the lands between. He died in laughter, a most Nietzschean way. I pronounce laughter holy. You higher men, learn to laugh. Alexander surely learned, and in him we can see the whole message of Elden Ring, to say yes to life, to laugh. Through its darkness and tragic elements, Elden Ring doesn't shy away from the reality of our world. It recognizes the suffering and struggling that demarcate our existence from that of inert matter. But at the same time, it does not fall to cynicism or pessimism through this recognition. Like Nietzsche, the tragic poets, and Berserk, it instead embraces life, struggle, and all. It accepts that this is our lot in existence and exclaims the beauty of our tragedy. Elden Ring reaches some of the highest heights in the world of video games, and to Nietzsche, it is only fitting that whoever climbs the highest mountain laughs at all tragic plays and tragic realities. This laughter is an affirmative response to the question of life. To all that comes with the tragic world, it says yes. It accepts all the struggling, suffering, and perseverance that allow us to see and experience that tragic existence. Elden Ring reflects the tragic beauty of our world. Through its gameplay, narrative, and especially its combination of these elements, it espouses a philosophy of struggle that finds understanding in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, Kentaro Miura, and C Thi Nguyen. This struggle is both a pain and a balm, a curse and a blessing. Simply, it is life. And concerning this life of curse, each must decide for themselves whether it is worth the cost it demands. But in the context of Elden Ring, it's clear to me that the admission price is peanuts compared to the exuberant beauty that the game delivers. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who watched this video, especially to the end. While I've explored these ideas a little bit in other videos, I haven't dedicated a video to this style other than my Frenzied Flame one, and this is an even further push in a new direction, especially with the game analysis. I hope it was enjoyable, as I would really like to do more of this kind of content for Elden Ring and other games. I think this kind of niche is one I really have the skill set to do well in. With that, I'd like to especially thank my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to join in that support, there will be links to do so on the screen and in the description. Everyone, thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and in the meantime, I hope this has supported the argument even just a little bit that the right answer is to say yes to life. Bye.